Hi guys, it's Maisha from Ace Academy. In this video today, I will solve the Cambridge O-Level Summer 2022 Economics Paper 2 Variant 2. As a general overview before we start, in this video today, I would solve the entire section A and only the section A. And for each answer and question that I go on, I would divide everything into two parts. First of all is the explanation part, is where I would explain all the terms, definitions needed from absolute scratch for you guys to understand. And then in the later part, it's where I would show you the answer written out in whole and, discuss a little about the mark distribution when needed. So, okay, with that being said, now let's move on to the video. All right. So here, in section A, you're given a really big source material. A lot of people, what they tend to do is instinctively just try to read the entire text word for word. In my opinion, it's far better for you to just skim through it just a little, and that's pretty much it, and not read the entire text word for word, for it can waste valuable time, because you're at the end of reading the entire text, you're most probably not going to remember most of the important information that's there on the ways. But just skim through it. What do I mean by skim through though? Okay, for that what I mean by skim through is that when you look at the certain information, look at what it's trying to tell you. So this entire graph is just a Bhutan fact file of 2018. That's it. That's all I need to know from this. I'm not going to go in details. In the next paragraph, I would just look for important words, or big words, or words that all can recognize just by looking at the paragraph, right? I can see words like life expectancy. I can see words like World Happiness Index, population, happiness of the population, and something about ranks, and just skim through. It doesn't have to be in detail. You don't have to look at all the important words. You just have to know what this is essentially about. And from the couple words that I saw, it has to do something about the rankings in terms of the happiness index or the human development index, because I saw those words over here. I did not see human development, I just saw happiness. So it has to be something about the happiness index, right? Okay. The next para, I see things like labor force, because it's red over light. Regardless of that, I can see big words such as productivity and tertiary sector. Is there any other words that I can see? Oh, there's investment and there's migration. Okay, so I know what this is also about now. It's about employment and migration. So it's about employment and it's about migration. Two different things. Okay. And this is what I mean by skimming through, right? I'll try to do this instead of reading the entire text word for word. All right. So now, with that being said, I'll just go over the rest of the paragraphs too. So this graph or this table chart is about GDP per head and net migration. Cool. I'm not going to analyze it right away. The next paragraph is about, let's look at important words. I see mental health. I see child poverty, pollution. So it's about living standards is what I can conclude, right? Yeah, living standards. I also see the word living. So it's pretty much about living standards, and I don't want to go into this. The last paragraph, I see the first word tax revenue, and is there any other thing that I see? Profits. So tax, profits, it's about corporations. Okay, so yeah, I know now what each paragraph is about. And, when I would have to read the questions, I know where to look for the questions, where to look for the answers, essentially. And that is the main motive of skimming through. Or if some of you do tend or do decide that you want to read everything, even that the fact that you're reading, the goal for you to be reading it is so that you can find the answers to your questions when time comes, right? So that being said, now let's move on to reading the questions. All right, 1A. calculate Bhutan's GDP in 2018. All right, before we go on to finding the answers, let's understand everything. What is GDP, right? So the GDP is short form for gross domestic product. And what is the GDP? It is a measure of the monetary value of goods and services within a country for a set period of time. What does that mean? It means that in a singular country, a country produces goods and service, right? So if you compile all of the goods and services from every industry, every firm, and every sector possible, and you make some sort of a monetary measurement and give all of those goods a certain value, that value for a set period of time, the goods produced within that set period of time, the monetary value of that is going to be your gross domestic product. Within our syllabuses, we're already given the equation for the gross domestic product. That is, GDP is equal to the consumption plus the investment, government spending, plus the net exports. All right? So what you would want to do is look for either any of these information in your text, right? So we're going to go back and we know that, we already had a Bhutan fact file from 2018 in our stimulus. So we just are going to look there first. Over here, we see things like government spending. And that's the only thing that I have for this equation. I don't have any other information given to me. Do I have anything in the later text? As far as I remember, I don't. None of the text or none of the paragraphs contained anything about exports, imports, consumption, or investment. However, if you still want to double check, you can at least, read through the first two paragraphs because, that is where the information is most likely going to be. So that's your first step, right? Trying to find the information from what your existing knowledge already tells you to. From what I'm getting, I don't have all the information that I need in order to use this equation. How shall I then proceed, right? What I would then do is look at the information that I actually have. So I have population, I have GDP per head, I have government spending, I have tax revenue, and I have two indexes. These two indexes are not going to help me. Government spending alone is not going to give me GDP. Government spending, tax revenue, both of these together aren't going to give me anything either. Well, GDP either. However, GDP per head and population does have a link to GDP, and that is something that I can guess. Just because GDP per head has the word GDP in it, so I would, even if I did not know what GDP per head was, I can still assume the GDP per head had some linkage to GDP. Therefore, it's a signal for me to use this information into finding out what the GDP is, right? So, what is GDP per head? GDP per head is just the GDP that we already talked about divided by the population of that country. So it's GDP per head, right? So per unit individual, the GDP per unit individual, it is the GDP per head, right? So we know the equation for GDP per head is GDP divided by population. We have the information of what the population is. We have information of what GDP is. Therefore, we can very easily derive indirect equation from here. What the indirect equation being that you move GDP, you move population from this area. Let me just highlight it. This is the equation that I'm talking about. So you move population, instead of dividing it, you just multiply it with GDP per head and you're going to get the GDP, right? Simple algebra. Or arithmetic, most probably. Anyways, so that is going to be your answer. In your answer, all you have to do is state the equation you're using and do the calculation. Using your calculator, you multiply the number of the amount given in terms of GDP per head, which is 3,250, into the population, which is 0.8 million, right? And it gives you your GDP, and you just write this. That's your answer. That's all you need. Okay, now let's move on to the second question. Identify two indicators that are both in the World Happiness Index and the Human Development Index. All right, just by reading this question and from my memory while I was scheming, I know that I had a paragraph talking about happiness. All right. And then the next part is the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is within the scopes of my syllabus, right? So the Human Development Index is a composite indicator of living standards in a country. A composite indicator meaning that it's just compiles a lot of different indicators together to give you a numerical value or a ranking chart in a chart. All right, so now we know what Human Development Index is. So what are the composite indicators that we're talking about? The composite indicators include life expectancy, education, and income. Income in terms of GDP per head, right? Okay, so that is the indicators of Human Development Index. Now what we need is the indicators of World Happiness Index so that we can find out the common indicators, right? So do we know what the World Happiness Index is? From our syllabus or within the scopes of our syllabus, we are not supposed to know what the World Happiness Index is, nor are we supposed to know what the indicators of World Happiness Index is. Therefore, it probably means that it is given to you in your syllabus. All you have to do is find out. Now, let's read the stimulus. We know it's not here. We just have the ranking. We don't have any indicators or numbers here, so it won't read. This chart isn't going to help us. Now let's read the material, right? The United Nations has published a World Happiness Index every year since 2012. This index ranks countries according to life expectancy, freedom, social support, trust, generosity, and GDP per head. We are already given the indicators by the second line. If you want, you can read the rest, but I feel like I don't need to because I already know what the indicators are and we have mentioned, right? So what I'll do is highlight this so that let's do this. I'll just highlight this. Okay, so now the next work is just to find out the common indicators. So life expectancy and life expectancy. So I know that that's a common indicator. Education, and we don't have education in the list, so education is not the common indicator. Income and GDP per head, we have income too, right? We have incomes too. For anyone who's wondered why income and GDP per head is the same thing, is because a way of measuring GDP is through there's an income method through which you can also measure GDP. So therefore, GDP per head would be just income levels, right? So your answer, since you only have to identify and there's only 2 marks, so it probably means that you just have to state the 2 indicators and you would just get 2 marks. You don't need to explain anything. So you're just writing a single sentence that the 2 common indicators used both in the World Happiness Index and the Human Development Index are life expectancy and GDP per head. That's all you need. All right, so we're done with 1B. Now let's move on. 1C. Statewide Bhutan's 2018 government budget is likely to have increased total demand input. All right. This is telling you to state something, right? Before we go deep into that, there are a few difficult words in this question, such as government budget and the total demand. We need to know what these words essentially mean for us to understand what the question is telling us to write about, right? So what is a government budget? A government budget is the relation between government spending and the government revenue, right? So if, you can think of the government budget as pretty much the government's wallet. Government spending is how much the government spends and gives out of the wallet, and government revenue is how much it earns and puts it back into the wallet. So a budget surplus, the government budget, when you are trying to describe what is going to happen or what is the state of the budget, you use 2 terms, either a budget deficit or a budget surplus, right? So a budget surplus is when the government revenue is greater than the government spending. which means that the government has more money in its wallet than it is giving out, right? It's getting more, therefore you have more in your wallet. So you have a surplus. A budget deficit is when the government spending is more than the government revenue. What does that mean? It means that you are giving up more money from your wallet than you are receiving. Therefore, you have a net negative balance, which is, a deficit, right? A budget deficit. All right. The second word that we encounter here is total demand. What is total demand? It's the aggregate demand in the country or the total demand in the country. And aggregate demand is calculated by the same equation which we use for the GDP, right? The consumption, investment, government expenditure plus net exports. The same equation is used, right? So now what we need to do is we need to find information about government spending and government revenue for us to understand what is happening, what is the state of the government budget in 2018 for Bhutan, and therefore what is going to likely happen to the aggregate demand, right? So first things first, government spending and government revenue. For Bhutan, we already know that there is a fact file. So we're just going to skim through that, right? We have government spending, we have tax revenue. We look at the numbers. For government spending, it's 450. With government tax revenue, it's just 380, which is less. So there's more government spending. If there is more government spending, you're giving up more than you're receiving. It means that you have a budget deficit. So we already know what a budget deficit is, right? So what are the information we already know just by reading and understanding the question? A, the fact that government spending is more than government tax revenue. That's your first information that you know. Secondly, it means that there is a budget deficit. All right, so what your next step is to identify what a budget deficit is going to cause, what change is it going to cause in the aggregate demand, all right? So now let's look at the equation for aggregate demand. It's consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports, right? So there is government expenditure, and it is a positive relationship with aggregate demand. A positive relationship means that, it's plus or multiplied. So like if there's more expenditure, there's more aggregate demand, if I'm talking in terms of maths, right? So from the equation above, you can very easily identify that since you have greater spending, meaning you have greater expenditure, you're likely to have an increase in the aggregate demand, right? An increase in the total demand. For those of you who want to know why does government expenditure tend to increase the aggregate demand, think of what government expenditure is essentially, right? It can be your goods, services that the government produce, transfer payments. It can be subsidies. Let's take subsidies for an example. If the government spends in terms of giving more subsidies, what is likely to happen, right? What's likely to happen is that your suppliers would be incentivized to sell the same product at cheaper prices, at cheaper price point. What does that mean? It means that, for example, if you bought a good or service XYZ for $10 before, after the subsidy, you're going to buy the good or product for, let's say, $8, right? So you have that $2 extra that you don't need to pay anymore because of the government expenditure. What you do with the $2 is that you can consume more, or you can reinvest that $2 back into the market, right? Whether it be in the forms of you just save the $2 or you reuse the $2 to buy another good. You are reusing it, and it increases the amount that the amount of goods and services that you are able to demand, therefore increasing the aggregate demand, right? That is how you can remember the correlation between government expenditure and aggregate demand without the equation. But the equation is really helpful. Please do try to remember the equation by heart. It is going to be needed in multiple scenarios, not only just for this paper, but for other questions and other papers too. Okay, so we have three information now. First, being that your government spending is greater than your tax revenue. Secondly, is that it has, on that scenario, is going to lead to a budget deficit. And the last information that we have concluded is that a budget deficit is going to lead to more government expenditure, or is like a signature of more government expenditure, and a more government expenditure is going to lead to aggregate demand. Now, how are you going to compile all of that into your answer? The wording of the question is that state why, right? And that's it. You just have to state why and not explain why. There's a difference, right? It didn't just say state what would happen. Then you could have just written that, there's going to be an increase in the total demand. If they would have stated that as state the effect, then all you had to write was the aggregate demand was going to increase. They're writing state why something is going to happen, right? State why the government budget is going to increase the total demand. Okay? It means that you need to talk about government expenditure or budget deficit and how that leads to an increase in aggregate demand. However, you do not need to explain, because they didn't tell you to explain why it's happening. They just need to they just asked you to state, right? So how would you then compile it? This is the answer written out. First of all, you would just state that what's the current scenario from the information that you already have. That is, Bhutan's government spending was something, and that's greater than the tax revenue, which was only something, right? That's your first line. After that, you write, what does that imply? It implies that there was a budget deficit. And then you just state that because there was a budget deficit, therefore it would have increased the total demand in Bhutan. You're stating why it happens without explaining why it happens, and you get all your answers. You get all your marks in points. You get 2 points here. All right, read it, and let's move on to number 1D. Explain 2 reasons why someone may prefer to work in the tertiary sector than in the primary sector. All right. So from my memory, I don't remember there being... Oh no, I do remember there being a paragraph about employment, right? And tertiary sector and primary sector is about employment. And I even remember reading the word tertiary sector in that. So what I would do is I would just instinctively just go here, right? And read the paragraph that contained those information, or read from the start, however way you like it. While more than half of Bhutan's labor force is employed in agriculture, most people in New Zealand are employed in the tertiary sector. Working conditions, working hours, and the type of work and pay vary with the pay vary between the primary and the tertiary sector. Productivity, they're already in the sentence. In the first part, we already are told what the situation is in each of these countries. In Bhutan, there is more agricultural stuff, and in New Zealand, there is more tertiary employment, right? In the next line, what we're told is the differences, or why are being primary or the tertiary sector different. This is going to be important because the question, if you remember, let's just pull up the question over here. So the question tells us to find differences, or show why somebody would have a preference over something, which means that you need to differentiate these 2 sectors, right? So this line would be really helpful for us. So what are the things that they're talking about? They're talking about working conditions, working hours, the type of work, and pay, right? So essentially, what you want to do while differentiating tertiary sector and primary sector is use these defining points as to how is the working conditions different in primary sector compared to tertiary sector? How are the working hours different? How is the type of work different? How is the pay different, right? That is what you would essentially want to highlight, given the fact that this line exists. If in a circumstance, this line or this sentence was not given to you, you can write about any difference that comes to your mind, right? Uh, but since this line or this information has been provided in your stimulus, it's best if you use this as your pillars to your question, right? Now, let's move on to actually going in detail. What is a sector? What is the tertiary sector? What is the primary sector? What does these even mean, right? So these sectors are what we refer to as sectors of employment. The work market or employment market is pretty much divided into three sectors. First of all, the primary sector. And what we talk about that is that any sector, industry, or farm that extracts raw materials, pretty much extracts raw materials, is within the scope of a primary sector. Therefore, any form of agricultural sector, you're extracting milk, you're extracting your crops, trees, fruits, whatever. All of these are agricultural sector. All of these are primary sector. All of these are where you extract raw materials from, for further production. The secondary sector is when you use the raw materials extracted into producing goods or services. They can be capital goods, they can be consumer goods, but you're pretty much just manufacturing, right? You're manufacturing these stuff. You're manufacturing goods for other people from the raw materials. The tertiary sector is the service sector. The last sector is the service sector. What this is that this sector gives you services, provides people with services, and conveniences. And it's not just producing goods. It is more dependent on services, for example, with tourism, right? That's a service. That's not essentially good, right? I think we all understand what services pretty much means. For example, if you went to the hairdresser, that would be a service. They are doing something for you that provides you with conveniences to meet your life. They're not essentially making any good for you. So those are the three sectors. Now you know what the tertiary sector is, what the primary sector is. What I want you to now do is link how the primary sector can be different in terms of working conditions. The primary sector can mean that the working conditions in the primary sector would be very rough. If you're in the agricultural sector, you most probably have to work in farms, in mills, in factories, maybe not factories, but like in mills, in farms, in sun, in rough weather and temperature, right? You're not going to be sitting into your office and desk work. How would the working conditions in tertiary sector be different, though? It can be different in terms of if your service is, let's say, a call center service, you would be sitting in an air-conditioned room in a table chair with electronics. You would have a lot of benefits and facilities, right? That is how the working conditions can be different. Working hours. For primary sector, the working hours can be different because, it can really be dependent on the type of crops you're growing or the type of product that you're producing. You can be working really early in the morning. You can be working really late at the night. Your work can only be seasonal if what you're producing only grows, for example, a certain season. We know agricultural products have a tendency to just grow in certain seasons and not grow in some, grow in certain weather conditions and not grow in some, right? So the working hours is very unpredictable, right? For the tertiary sector, it's pretty much a 9 to 5 job, right? Somebody pays you, you go there, you earn. Maybe you're freelancing, so there's actually no working hour at all. You just, whenever you feel like working, you work. The working conditions are different in that sense, right? The type of work for primary sector can be very hands-on. You might have to plow the fields, graze, take your cows to grazing. The type of work is very different to tertiary sector, where you're more involved with human interactions, human communication, etc. The pay in primary sector is what we know very less because it is an essential goods and services. and raw materials. So these are, the pay for these or the profit margins for these are tend to be very, very small, right? For the tertiary sector, the pay might be really high because these are conveniences. People pay a lot. These are sometimes these are considered as luxury goods and services. So people might pay a lot for them, and the profit margin can be a lot. So the pay would vary. So now you know what the basic differences are. You can write about any two differences that you want. Two differences for primary sector, two differences for tertiary sector, and you would get your 4 marks, right? When I say two differences per primary sector, I mean like you can say that primary XYZ happens in primary sector, but it doesn't happen in the tertiary sector. And ABC happens in the primary sector and doesn't happen in the tertiary sector. Or you could rephrase your answer to XYZ happens in the tertiary sector but does not happen in the primary sector. Or ABC happens in the tertiary sector and does not happen in the primary sector. Don't write 4 different, what do you call it? Try not to write 4 different differences. Write 2 differences and explain them. So you get 2 marks for identifying the differences and 2 marks for explaining the differences and why they're different, right? So yeah, how would you then write it? Let's look at the answer. People might prefer to work in the tertiary sector as it provides better wages than the primary sector. So over here, we're talking about pay, how the pay vary, right? The tertiary sector needs higher qualified individuals. Okay, hence there is a limit on the supply available. Therefore, wages tend to be higher. These high wages allow the workers to have a higher standard of living and disposable income. All right, this is a very elaborate explanation, right? What does this essentially tell you? It tells you that in the tertiary sector, while you're providing services, while you're working with people, you need to have a lot of high-level skills. For example, communication skills, maneuvering through technology, or advanced research and development. All of these are things that you need to work with while you're providing services to people on a daily basis. And these are not things that you would need for the agricultural staff. The agricultural staff is pretty basic. You don't have high-level skills involved. You have a set pattern of work and you just do that, right? Therefore, it's harder for people to qualify to be in the tertiary sector than to qualify to be in the agricultural sector. What does that mean? It means that you have a shortage in the labor supply for your tertiary sector, meaning that, the wages tend to be higher, right? Because, the shortage of labor leads to wages being higher. Pretty much the demand supply theory over here. Therefore, there is a higher pay. In this first part, not only do you identify the difference, the exact difference, not only are you just identifying that pay is different, you're also identifying which sector pays more, which sector pays less, right? So that is the first point. The second point is the entire explanation as to why does it pay more, how is it different, why does that not happen in the primary sector, and that is what you do throughout all of this, right? From here to here, you pretty much just explain why the difference exists, why is it true, why does it not happen in the primary sector. Okay, so you got 2 marks out of the 4. Now let's move on to the second para. This is where you're going to identify the second differences, right? So people might also prefer the tertiary sector due to it being less physically demanding. Over here, we're talking about the type of work, right? Okay. Unlike the agricultural sector, the tertiary sector does not require manual labor in the fields, which is uncomfortable and tiring. Such conveniences attract workers. All right, what are we talking about? We're talking about the type of work that is involved, right? Over here, we're telling you that, unlike the agricultural sector, the tertiary sector does not require manual labor. What it means that the agricultural sector does require manual labor, and that is something that's not done in the tertiary sector. And why is manual labor a problem? We also explain it by writing that it's uncomfortable and it's tiring. Okay. So not first of all, we tell you why is it less physically demanding by stating that there's a lot of manual labor involved. And then you are also writing that while manual labor is problematic because it's uncomfortable and tiring. And lastly, you draw the link or you tie it back together that since, these things are not existent in the tertiary sector, these are conveniences to the labor, to the worker, right? Therefore, it attracts the worker and therefore people prefer or the workers prefer the tertiary sector. Again, you are getting your point for not only choosing one of the defining work conditions from this material, you're also stating which is, less physically demanding and which is not physically demanding. And then you're properly explaining it as to why is it less physically demanding and why does that lead to more preference for tertiary sector. With that, you get your other 2 points and you have your 4 points for, I think this is 1D. Now let's move on to 1E, the next question. Analyze how investment in capital goods and education can increase New Zealand's productivity. All right, so you have 4 marks here, right? So for analyze questions, the first thing that you need to do is know what is required for questions that have the word analyze in front of them. It basically means that you need to give me reasons as to why X, Y, Z, or whatever is written in your question is true, or reasons for why I would believe X, Y, Z is supposed to be true, right? That is pretty much what analyze questions ask you to do. Now, so first of all, some big words in the question, right? Investments in capital goods and education, right? So how would your investments, what are investments, right? So investments is just you putting it more effort, more resources, more money, etc. You prioritize on these sort of areas. All right. Can increase New Zealand's productivity. What is productivity? Productivity is the relationship between the values of goods and services produced by a worker and the time taken to produce them. So it's basically just output divided by time, right? Output divided by input is measured in forms of time. All right, so great. But now we know what productivity is. Now let's talk about what does investment in capital goods look like? What is this, when you read the question, what are some of the instances that should flood through your brain, right? So investments in capital goods can look like, so capital goods are just goods that you use to produce other goods, right? So for example, your sewing machine, that is a good in and on itself, but it's a capital good because through that good, through a sewing machine, you make clothes or you make other goods which are now called consumer goods, because I can just buy a piece of t-shirt and wear it and use it for myself, for my own necessities, right? Or wants or whatever. I'm not using the t-shirt to make another good, or else the t-shirt also would have been a capital good. Here, the sewing machine is a capital good. We know what capital good is, right? So if you invest in capital goods, it can almost pretty much take 3 different forms. Of course, it can, differ. It can sometimes be, there can be other forms of investment, but like primarily there's just 3 instances that is more likely to happen. First of all, is that you can invest in the terms that you're increasing the number of capital goods there. So you're adding more machines that produce the same goods. That's one. The second can be there are better machines. So let's say you have the same number of machines. It's just each machine can produce better quality of goods. And lastly, it can just be that old machines are being replaced with new ones. So you're getting rid of the old machines and you're replacing them with new ones, right? That can be another form of investment. Okay, now what would investment in education look like, right? Education is your schooling, your colleges, your schools, all of that. So when you invest in education, it means either you're increasing the number of institutions that, provide you with educational services. For example, you are increasing the number of schools and colleges and universities there are. Investment in education can look like increasing the quantity or the quality of teachers. It can look like you're subsidizing education for the poor, so you're giving it for free. It can look like a rebranding of the curriculums, teaching advanced curriculums, etc. There's going to be many different ways you can invest in education. I've just listed a few so that you understand what basically does the question mean. So essentially, what is the question asking you? It is asking that if there's more investments in capital goods and if there's more investments in education goods, and these are the examples of the more investments in capital goods and educational goods, how would all of these affect the productivity of New Zealand? And that is pretty much what your question is asking, right? So first things first, try to see if there are there are answers given or not, right? Over here we have a paragraph for productivity, from what I remember. So productivity is higher in all sectors in New Zealand than in Bhutan. This is partly the result of higher investment in capital goods and education in New Zealand. New Zealand also has a higher GDP per head. GDP per head can influence net migration. Okay, then we'll just move on to a new topic, which is on migration, right? So there isn't much information that we're given on productivity and how higher investments in capital goods and education is going to lead to productivity. Therefore, it's just stated over here that this happens, right? If there's more investment in capital goods and education, it would lead to productivity. Therefore, what we need to do is draw the bridge. How would the investment lead to the productivity, right? So again, to recap, productivity is the output per unit time. And these are all the ways, or there are more, but these are pretty much the basic ways where we can invest in things like capital goods and education. Now, what you need to do is just sit down and think to yourself, okay, how would all of these result in either more output or less time, right? So first and foremost, if there's more machines, right? Let's talk about capital goods first. If there's more machines, means that you can produce more output, right? If there's more machines than humans, it means that, a single unit of labor can produce more goods because machines generally tend to produce, in greater quantities than humans, because humans, we are humans, we have our limitations. There's only so much we can do, but machines aren't like us. They can work for longer hours, they can work in greater paces, they can be more efficient, right? That can happen. We can talk about the quality. If there's quality of things increase, output would increase, or the value of the goods and services. It's not just the amount, it's the value, right? So if the quality increases of your goods produced, then the output would also increase, right? Education. So now we know how capital goods and productivity can be linked. Now let's talk about education. Okay, if there is more investments in education, there can be more institutions, there's going to be subsidized education, right? What does that mean? It means that there's going to be more skilled labor in the market. If there's more skilled labor, your value of goods and the amount of goods, so not only the quantity, but the quality would also increase. If there is better teachers, it means you can have higher skilled, not just skilled, but like extra skilled or highly skilled workers out there. So that can increase your output by great margin. There's so many things that can happen with education, right? People would know when to invest, how to be more efficient, how to not create waste, etc., right? So that's pretty much a lot of the things that can happen. In order for you to write this answer properly, what I would suggest is this is the part where you don't write down, right? This is the part where you just understand, or you just, take 2 minutes of your time and think about it. Okay, this is this, and if that happens, then this will happen, right? These are just how you should be thinking automatically in your brain at the exam time, right? This is the part which I would advise students to write down. This entire region is what I sometimes advise students to write down, because doing this would help you see the structure of your answer much better. Therefore, you can write it more, your answer will be just more structured. However, it's just 4 marks. So if you want to not give as much effort, then sure. But for if there you have analyzed questions for like 6 marks later down the line, please try to make this little list of what you're actually going to include. What are the content points you're actually going to include, right? So what are the things that I have chosen? I talked about a lot of different things and scenarios that can happen. What I decided that I want to actually write is 4 different things, right? First of all, I can talk about more output per worker. I can talk about, machines or capitals can work longer hours, and humans can also work longer hours, enabling the use of advanced technology, which is not only through the capital goods, but also through education. Efficiency, again, not only through capital goods, but also through education. So all of these are things that I would get not only through education or just capital goods, but both of the investments in both these areas lead to these 4 criteria being met or achieved, right? So now, since you have 4 marks, how would you approach writing? Would you write all 4 of these points? The answer to that is no. Try not to write all 4 points, because this is what the mark distribution for 4-mark question essentially is, right? For analyzed questions, you have 2 marks for 2 different content points, and you have 2 marks for the explanation of that content point, right? So it means you just give 1 mark. So if I say more output per worker, that would just give me stating in a sentence that more output per worker would give me 1 mark. And then if I explain it properly, that why would investment in capital goods and education lead to more output per worker, then I would get my 2nd mark. And that's just 1 content point, and you repeat it for a 2nd content point, and therefore, 2 plus 2, you get 4. And that is how the entire mark distribution works. Okay, now that we're done explaining what the question means, what are the things that you need to talk about, and this, all the content points that we could find, right? How would you then write it? This is the answer that I wrote. Okay. Productivity is the relationship between the value of goods and services produced by a worker and the time taken to produce them. In New Zealand, higher investments in capital goods or goods used in the making of other consumer goods can increase the output per unit time, as the workers are better equipped to produce. All right, before I go any further, the first sentence is that I just give the definition of what productivity is. You don't essentially have any marks over here, but it's just better to give it. It gives your answer more structure, and it can help you back up your explanations later down the line. So it's just a good advice for you to write the definition not only of productivity, as in the 2nd line, I also write the definition of capital goods. Any words that, you cannot find in the Urban Dictionary, there is a separate economic definition for that word or that term or that phrase. Try to give the definition of it within your answers. If it's like anything more than a just state or identify question, if it's explain, analyze, discuss, try to give the definitions. All right. So in the 2nd line, I talk about higher investments in capital goods, and then I talk about what the definition of capital good is, and then I just state that it would increase output per unit time. So up until this, I got my 1 mark. Now I move on to explaining why would that increase output per unit time. With that, I write, as the workers are better equipped to produce, right? That is my explanation. Okay. With greater use of capital goods, time spent producing can increase as goods need far less rest than workers, right? This is further explanation, right? This is just further explanation for the same content point, that it increased the output per unit time. Okay. By this, I have already finished stating my 1 point and explaining that 1 point. Now we move on. Higher investments in education will produce better skilled workers in the future for New Zealand. Such workers, so this line over here, higher investments in education, is me just stating what would happen. That is my one content point. So, in short, from here to here, I get 1 mark, right? From here to here, I get my second mark because I was explaining my first content point. Okay. This is my second content point, and this is my second mark. My third mark. And my last mark is the explanation as to why investments in education would create better skilled workers and how would that affect and increase the productivity, right? So with this, I write, such workers would be able to be more efficient and make less waste per unit production. They would also be better able to use more advanced technology. This would increase both the quality and the quantity of output per unit time, increasing the productivity of New Zealand. That is adequate explanation for that one single content point. And with that, I secure my last mark and the fourth mark. This is the answer. This is my answer that I would have written if I had gotten that question. Okay, now let's move on. F. Analyze the relationship between GDP per head and net migration. This is a 5-mark question. Okay. Again, it's an analyze question, so you need to state the reasons. You need to state the relationship between GDP and net migration, and, it's not an argumentative answer. Okay. First of all, what is GDP per head? We have already discussed about GDP per head, I think in the first or the second question, I don't remember, but yeah, we already discussed about GDP per head, right? So the GDP per head is just a measure of the standards of living, right? Yeah. So the GDP per head is just a measure that the economists use to calculate standards of living. It's also referred to as GDP per capita. The equation is also something that we have discussed before. It is found by dividing the real GDP by the population, right? So we know what GDP per head means. Now, what is net migration? Before we get to the net migration, let's talk about what is migration. Migration is just the act of moving from one country to another, almost permanently, right? To settle down. So net migration is the immigration number minus the emigration number. So what is the immigration number? It is the number of people entering the country from foreign lands. So it's, for example, if you are in the US, if other people come into the US, that is your emigration number, right? That's your immigration number, the number of people entering the country. Now, what is emigration number? It's simply the number of people leaving your country. So if there are people who are leaving the US to settle, let's say, in France, right? So those people would be your immigrants, right? Do not confuse, try not to confuse between the words immigration and emigration. It's quite important. So the net migration is just the number of people leaving your country minus the number of people the number of people entering your country minus the number of people leaving your country, right? That is net migration. Okay. Now, before we move on, net migration can be also described, or, the state of migration can also be described using the words emigration and net emigration and net immigration, right? What does these two words mean? If your immigration is greater than your emigration, there's going to be net immigration, right? If there is more people entering the country, there's going to be a net immigration. There's going to be a net immigration if there's more number of people entering the country. Okay, if there is more number of people leaving the country, there is going to be an emigration. So if more people enter, that's immigration. If more people leave, that's emigration. Okay. So how would you now write the answer? So the GDP per head, right? Before we move on, right? What is the relationship between GDP per head? Try to think about it. If the GDP per head is positive or is increasing, what would that mean, right? It would mean that the living standards is increasing. If the living standards of a singular country is increasing, what would that state? It would state that, that country is getting better. So people from other countries would want to settle in, right? People, for example, if you're from the subcontinent, if you're from the Asia or any other developing country, people from developing country tend to migrate towards developed country. Why do they do so? Because of better living standards, better job opportunities, etc., right? So that is the relationship between GDP per head and net migration, right? However, let's look into our charts and our text to see if we have any information. Okay. New Zealand also has a higher GDP per head. GDP per head can influence net migration as shown for the selected countries in 2017. Okay. So this is the chart that pretty much has our answer for this question, right? So let's analyze the chart first. Let's look in depth as to what this chart is going to tell us. So the white barcodes that you see, the white charts that you see, is the net migration or the number of people, right? So if there's a positive net migration, which is it's more, it's over here. It means that there is more immigration. If there is negative net migration, it means that there is more emigration, right? Okay. So in countries which have the darker charts or the darker bars is the GDP per head. Okay, let's look at what this graph essentially tells us. So what we can first really easily identify is that the country with the highest GDP per head, which is over here, has the highest number of the most positive or the highest number of net migration going on, which means that there's a lot of people coming into this country. There's a lot of people coming into New Zealand. All right. Now we look at the other, the two second highest countries with GDP per head. We see that their net migration is also positive and it's also pretty large, right? Okay, and then we have Bhutan, right? Which is like the fourth greatest country in terms of GDP per head. And they also have the fourth greatest net migration number. Now we have Kenya and Mozambique, right? Where the GDP per head is significantly less compared to the other countries, and we can see that they have a negative net migration, which means people are leaving their countries. People are emigrating instead of immigrating, right? So people are leaving their country. Okay, so this is what we see. However, do notice that Kenya has higher GDP per head than Mozambique, but Kenya has far greater net negative migration than Mozambique. What does that imply? It implies that there is an exception to the rule that we have already established. What was the rule that we established? That the GDP per head and the net migration had a positive relationship. What does that mean? If there's more GDP per head, there's going to be more net migration towards that country, right? However, over here, we can see the exception. That is, even though Kenya has a greater GDP per head than Mozambique, Kenya also has a greater net negative migration than Mozambique, which is an exception to the rule that we have established. All right, is there any other information that we might have missed out from this chart? I feel like we have not, I feel like we have discussed everything needed to be discussed from this chart. So now we know all of our information, right? We know what we were given by the charts. We know what the question means. Now, how would you then approach the question? First and foremost, you would give your definition, right? You would give your definition. Great. Now, you would then state the rule that you have established. If, for example, do you think that the GDP per head has a positive relationship with net migration? Do you think it has an inverse relationship with the net migration? Do you think it has a proportional relationship with net migration? What do you think is happening? Just state the general overview statement, right? The bottom line statement that, okay, this happens. You just state that. That is your second, the second thing that you need to do. After that, what you need to do is you need to provide evidence. Why do you need to provide evidence? Because you were given the chart. And remember, every time you're given any information in the paper, in your material source for section A, you have to write, you have to mention that or cite that in your answers. This is why you need evidence. Okay, we can collect evidence over here. What would our evidence be? It would be the fact that, New Zealand has a very high GDP per head, and therefore it also has a very high net positive migration. We can talk about all these positive GDP or these great GDP per heads and how they have led to, or they have, none of these countries are seen to have high net positive migration as well, right? These are all our evidence which support the general overview statement, right? So this is evidence in support. Okay. After that, you need, since there is an exception, right? You also need to talk about that exception. If, however, in a different circumstance or in a different paper, there is no exception, everybody follows the rule, you would not need to write exceptions, right? Okay. So over here, we are going to give example of the exception. What does that mean? We're going to talk about Kenya and Mozambique and how their GDP plays with their net negative migration, all of that. The last thing that you're going to do is you're going to explain. We're going to explain why the evidence is true, why the exceptions are true, and all of that. What do I mean by that? Since it is an analyze, at the end of the day, you still have to give me reasons to believe your general overview statement, right? Therefore, in this explanation part, you're going to state the reason that, okay, this is why the general overview statement is true or it happens, right? So you give that in the last para, in the explanation, or in the conclusion, however you would want it. Okay, with that being said, let's read the question, the answer. Net migration is the immigration number, the number of people entering the country from foreign lands, minus the emigration number, the number of people leaving the country for foreign lands. As the GDP per capita increases, which is an indicator for living standards, there has been a trend of increasing net immigration or positive migration and vice versa. Alright, in the first para, what do? I talk about the definitions. I pretty much include all the definitions there is. I talk about net migration, I talk about immigration and emigration. I also talk about GDP and what does the GDP refer to or indicate. It's an indicator for the living standards. So I give all my definition, and at the same time, I also mention my general overview statement, right? Which is that there is the trend of increasing net migration or positive migration, right? So as the GDP per capita increases, so an increase over here would lead to an increase in the net immigration, or there would be a positive migration, right? And vice versa. And the fact that this is also reversive, that if the GDP per capita decreases, there would be a trend of decreasing net migration or negative migration going on, net immigration or negative migration going on, right? So that is done. So the first two things are done in my first round. Now I would give evidence. How many evidences would you give? Since you have an exception to write about, my advice is to just give two. Since you have 5 marks for here, give two evidences for, and then talk about the exception that you have. All right, so one is the evidence that I gave. As seen in this figure 1.1, as the GDP per head increased among Bhutan, Slovenia, Cyprus, and New Zealand, there has been an increase in positive net migration. That's my first evidence that I give, right? Is that as the GDP increases, so Bhutan is the smallest positive net migration going on. And then we have Slovenia, and then Cyprus, and then New Zealand. In that specific order, I try to write the increase in that very specific order as well. So it's Bhutan, Slovenia, Cyprus, and then New Zealand. All right, there has been an increase in positive net migration. Okay, there has been an increase in positive net migration, and I can see that, right? Okay, that's my first evidence. Now my second evidence is that New Zealand, with the highest GDP per head, has the highest positive migration, right? Okay, this is true. This is my my second evidence is that GDP has the highest. New Zealand has the highest GDP per head, and therefore it also has the highest net migration, net positive migration, right? Okay. Kenya and Mozambique, who have the lowest GDP per head, have negative net migration. I happen to add a third evidence over here for good measure, right? What do I say? Kenya and Mozambique, in total, who have the lowest GDP per head, have net negative migration going on. This is also a positive, this is also an evidence for my general statement. Okay. But at the same time, over here, I write about the exception and give example of the exception. What do I write? However, Kenya and Mozambique are exceptions, as Kenya has a higher GDP per head, but higher net emigration than Mozambique, right? What does that mean? Over here, I state that Kenya and Mozambique are exceptions. Okay. Why are they exceptions? It's because Kenya has a higher GDP, as we can see from our graph over here. It's very small, the rate at which it's more, but there is still, Kenya is greater than Mozambique in terms of GDP per head. However, instead of leading to, having a better net migration in Kenya than Mozambique, the opposite happened. There is far greater net negative migration in Kenya than there is in Mozambique, and that is what I write here, right? Okay. So the last para is where I explain. What do I write here? The trends exist possibly because the higher GDP per head in one country encourages individuals from other countries to move there in search for better living standards and life in general. I explain why the general overstatement, the overview statement is true. Why is it true? It's because, since there is more GDP per head, it means there's better living standards, and therefore that encourages other individuals from other countries to move there, therefore leading to more immigration happening for that country, right? The reverse applies for low GDP countries. With that statement, I explain why countries like Kenya and Mozambique, who have less GDP per head or a lower GDP per head, also have a far less net migration number, which leads to a net negative migration number. Okay. However, the exceptions still exist. All right. Now, why would the exceptions exist? Think about it. There has to be more indicators, right? There has to be more reasons for emigration and migration and immigration to happen than just being GDP per head. There has to be many other reasons why people would want to leave our country or would not want to leave our country, would go to our country and would not go to our country. So just write about the other factors and mention that there might be other factors, right? So what do I write? However, the exceptions exist as there are other factors that influence net migration. I give a few examples, for example, like migration controls, socio-political status. You can write about religious differences. You can write about war. You can write about job opportunities. There are many things that you can write about, right? many other factors that you can just think from the top of your head. So with that, we finish question number 1F. Okay, now let's move on to our second last question. Discuss whether or not enterprise is likely to have increased in New Zealand after 2019. In this question, it's a discuss question. Therefore, it means you have to give some information and explanations for the motion proposed, which is, whether or not it's going to increase. So, for, meaning that it is going to increase, then you have to talk about against, it's not going to increase, and then you have to evaluate your points, right? So in the question that's given, we are not given any information as to why would it increase, what would happen, what is happening in 2019. That just pretty much means that you have to really heavily rely on the information provided over here. Okay, we have read up to the chart, right? Now let's read the next part. In 2019 budget, the New Zealand government said it would measure its progress not by increases in GDP, but by increases in the quality of people's life. To achieve this, it announced increased spending on some areas, including mental health. Okay, so this is what is something that happened in 2019, right? Okay. So there has been an increased spending on areas such as mental health, child poverty, and pollution. Great. Next is some economists criticized this approach. They argued the best way a government could improve living standards is to reduce income tax rates. Okay, this is also something that might have happened, right? We don't know for sure what has happened, right? So we're just going to take anything that might have happened. Okay. So this reduction could change government spending and the quantity of products that people buy, including cars. Okay. The tax revenue has increased in New Zealand in 2019. Okay. So there has been a tax revenue increase. Partly because of a raise in revenue from corporation taxes. So there was a raise in revenue. Okay. It was difficult to predict the firm's future profits. This is because of uncertainty about what would happen to its GDP and corporation tax rates. Okay, so we have uncertainty, right? So we don't know for sure. This can also be a good point for us. What are we uncertain about? We're uncertain about the future of the GDP and corporation taxes. So taxes might go up, might go down, the GDP might increase, might not increase. We don't know. From the information here, on my first glance, these are the things that I can easily identify, right? Okay. Now let's list these information down. That will help us a lot. Okay. From the material given, what are the things that we have? Increase in government spending. Okay. So increase in mental health. Okay, investing, there's going to be more investments in mental health. There's going to be more investments in child poverty mitigation. There's going to be more investment in pollution control. And that is in the first line that we have highlighted. Then we have a cut in income tax rates, right? Yes. To reduce the income tax rates, we have a cut in income tax rates. Okay. What are the other informations that we have? Okay, we have higher investments in capital goods and education, and these are the things that we have seen in the past, right? So over here, we have seen things like education and capital goods going on, even though this was not just in these aren't things that have happened in 2019. These are things that have happened before. But even though it has happened before, it can have effects in the future, right? For example, your capital goals in education can have massive changes in the future because after implementing them, your productivity would increase. So there might be an increase in GDP, right? The net immigration was higher. We know that the net immigration was higher in 2017, so that might bring in more skilled workers. So these are the changes that could have happened and that could have continued within the time frame of this question, which is 2019 and in New Zealand, right? All of the information from the text that we have. Okay. Discuss whether or not. So the next part is to link all of these changes back to whether or not it would have increased the number of enterprise. The number of enterprise pretty much means the number of businesses, startups, and all of those stuff in New Zealand after 2019. Okay. So for structures, right? What are the things that we need to talk about? For structure, we have a few things. First of all, is for. What does that mean? It means that you need to write in favor of an increase in enterprises. How? So, your next question is to ask yourself, how would all of these information or some of these information combine together to create an increase in the number of enterprises, right? So, first and foremost, if there is more government spending, right? What would that mean? It would increase demand, right? It would increase demand. Okay, the second things that we have is mental health and then reduce child poverty, reduce your pollution. All of these contributes to your living standards, the general living standards of your society. If there's going to be a decrease in the general living standard of your country, what does that mean? It means that people are going to be more productive, and that is something that we have already discussed about in our last questions, right? Okay. Then we have a cut in income tax rates. What does that mean? It means that people can demand more. Why? Because there's more disposable income. Okay. So what are the things that can happen, right? Oh, so investments in capital goods or education, we have already talked about how that would increase productivity in our last question. There can be many other things that you can derive from these, but just looking at these, the things that come at the top of my head is the fact that there's going to be an increase in living standards, there's going to be an increase in productivity, there's going to be an increase in demand. All right, now against. So how would these lead to a decrease in the enterprises or not lead to an increase in the enterprises, right? So let's look at the first point, increase in government spending. If there's an increase in government spending, it means every time there's an increase in government spending or there is any talk about government spending, there will always be an opportunity cost, right? If you spend more in sectors such as, mental health, child poverty, and pollution, it means you are not spending in some other sector because you have a fixed budget, right? So there's going to be an opportunity cost. Secondly, since you're talking about pollution control, how would you rely or how would you carry out that pollution control? That can be in the forms of taxes, right? Taxes on producers who produce the pollution, on farms and industries who produce the pollution. You can give them higher taxes, and that is how you can control them, right? So that can increase taxes. Okay. If there is a more government spending and there's a cut in tax revenue, what would that lead to? It would lead to a decrease in your budget, in your budget available, and that's going to create a budget deficit. How would we do it? We have already discussed before, right? So if you are spending more than you're earning, by earning we mean by income, by taxes, and from here we say that there's a cut in tax rates. There's a reduction in the earnings, and there's an increase in the spendings. That would likely lead to a budget deficit, right? So, okay. So that happens. Is there any other thing that we're missing? Oh, uncertainty. We don't know. From over here, where it's written that we don't know what is going to happen to GDP and the corporation tax. So, if the GDP decreases, right, people will not want to invest as much. People will not want to save as much. the likelihood of new startups and enterprises increasing is not going to happen, right? So, and even corporation tax. So if there's very high corporation taxes or taxes placed on the producers, people would just not want to start their businesses, right? These are things that would happen. So uncertainty is a reason why the motion would not work. Okay, so we have our points for the proposed scenario. We have our points against. All we need to do is jot down this properly in like a para. First give your definition, write all the 4 points, and then write all the against points, then give your evaluation, and then you put your conclusion, right? The evaluation is pretty much against as to why it would not happen. How did I answer this question? I divided it into 2 paras. In the first para, I wrote, let's zoom in. Okay, in 2019, the New Zealand government has decided to take multiple steps, such as increasing government spending in sectors such as mental health, poverty, and pollution. The increase in government spending will directly increase the aggregate demand of the country, which will facilitate the growth from more enterprises in order to cater to the rise in demand. What are the things by demand? What are the things that I already talked about? I point out evidence, right? I use the stimulus and I almost fight the stimulus, and I pointed out that from the material we know that in 2019 the government would take or has decided to take multiple steps in this. It has increased government spending, right? So I have evidence. Okay. The next thing that I need to do is write, and the next thing I did is that what would break this down, right? Break this entire sentence down. How would government spending affect the country? How would, things like mental health, poverty, and pollution, betterment in these sectors would affect the country and the economy? I tried to break it down. Then I talk about government spending, right? If there is more government spending, we know from the formula of aggregate demand that has already been discussed a couple times, even in this paper already, that your government spending or government expenditure has a positive relationship with the aggregate demand or the GDP. If there is more GDP and there's more aggregate demand in the country, it would mean that there's more demand, right? That's just what the sentence means. There's higher aggregate demand means that there's more demand. If there's an increase in demand, people would need to supply more, right, to cater to that demand, and therefore it would increase your enterprises or the number of enterprises available. All right. What do I then say? Spending in these specific areas. Okay, I went into more deep. I talk about mental health, poverty, and pollution over here. Would also increase the living standards of the country, which would motivate individuals to become entrepreneurs. What does that mean? If there is a higher living standards, it means you're earning more. It means you are more knowledgeable. You know how to or where to make money. Therefore, you would be more motivated and inspired to become entrepreneurs. If you decide to become entrepreneurs, there's going to be a rise in enterprises. Okay. So I have given a couple explanations, right? So I've given one explanation, which is aggregate demand would increase, and then I have given my second explanation. That is second content point and explanation is that it's going to increase living standards, and how would that play out and increase enterprises, right? Okay. Now for the third one is that with better mental health services, reduced pollution and poverty, there might be also an increase in worker productivity. If there's more worker productivity, it means that you have more output per unit product. It means your GDP would increase. If your GDP increases, it is going to help you, right? It is going to create more enterprises or make room for more enterprises in your country. Okay, so increase in worker productivity. Additionally, reduction in the income tax rate as advised by the economists, which is something that it happens, and then I cite it, is over here. The economists criticized the approach. They argued this entire line. I try to cite it here. Okay, would create greater profit incentives, which would encourage the growth of enterprises. What does this mean? It means that since there's a reduction in income tax, it means that your profit margins is going to be far greater because you don't need to give away your profits to the government in the form of taxes, right? Therefore, you are going to earn more profit per unit product, which means it is going to motivate and inspire people to try to become businessmen and entrepreneurs so that they can have their own enterprises. So this entire para is me trying to cater to the fact that there's going to be an increase in enterprises, right? The 4 points. Okay. However, this is where I get into the against point or the evaluation points. Government spending in sectors would have opportunity costs. Very simple. Why is that banned, and why will that lead to a reduction in enterprise and not lead to an increase in enterprise? Is because the government spending, the opportunity cost of the government spending can take many different forms. It can, for example, over here I talk about subsidies. There's going to be a reduction in subsidies amounts for new enterprises. If there's a reduction in subsidies, what would that mean? It would discourage a lot of people from taking loans, from starting their starting their enterprises. So that might lead to a decrease in enterprise, right? Okay. So that's my first explanation point for against, or in my evaluation. In my second point, I write, in order to combat pollution and poverty, the government might introduce a tax on externalities, which would discourage new entrepreneurs from arising. Makes sense, right? If the government wants to control pollution, it would, or any the externalities produced by these firms and enterprises, the government would have to introduce taxes. If there's high taxes, people would not want to become entrepreneurs because your profit margin decreases, right? So that's my second point, second explanation and content point for against in my evaluation. Okay, the increase in government spending paired with the reduction in tax might lead to a budget deficit. This is something that we already discussed. There's more money outflow than inflow, which would lead to a budget deficit. How would that then lead to a decrease of enterprises? Is that it will lead to inflation, and it can lead to high interest rates. What would inflation and high interest rates mean for the new entrepreneurs? It would mean that they cannot borrow, and therefore they cannot invest to start off their new enterprises. Therefore, there would be a reduction, or there won't be an increase. All right, so all of these circumstances would not lead to the enterprises increasing in New Zealand. Okay, that's pretty much all there is for this. With that, I explained 3 points for and 3 points against. So I'm pretty much covered as to what I need to write for this specific answer. Okay. Last question for section A is that discuss whether or not a cut in income tax rates would increase living standards. Okay. Is there anything that we're given over here? A cut in income tax rates and living standards. I feel like there is nothing over here we've pretty much read the entire stupid list from word to word by now, and there isn't much that we have, we can take directly from the material. Therefore, a lot of it would have to be, from your own knowledge. Okay. So, what is living standards? Again, living standards it's just, how good the country is in terms of the services and goods and facilities provided that it can provide for its citizens. All right, there's a ranking, and we figure out which country is better and has better living standards through that ranking. Living standards can be identified or calculated, and there's multiple ones. The living standard of a country is an aggregate of all of these different big, small indicators everywhere, right? So first and foremost, there's GDP per head, right? There is income, which is the GDP per head. There's employment. There is the price of goods, which is an inflation rate. There's your education levels. There's your healthcare. There's so many different things. So this is not an exhaustive list at all. There's so many other things that can lead to high tax rates, to living standards being changed, right? Okay. So what you need to do in this question is just link all of these indicators back with income tax, right? If I cut income taxes, how would that affect all of these indicators, and how would the effect on these indicators have an effect on the living standard? That's pretty much the flow of information that needs to be there for your answer, right? Okay, cool. Before I move on, a cut in income tax, what does that mean? It pretty much means that the income tax, which is a tax you pay to the government on the earnings, on your own personal earnings, is called the income tax, right? So if there's a cut in income tax, you're just giving away less money, meaning you have more money in your hand, more cash, more earnings in your hand, disposable to you than before, right? Okay, now let's talk about for and let's talk about against. Okay, would a cut in income tax rate lead to an increase in living standards? For the for part, the answer is very intuitive, right? If you have more money in your hand, you have more disposable income. What does that mean? It means that you can spend more, right? If you spend more, if consumption increases, your total demand increases. Total demand increasing can lead to your GDP increasing, which would definitely, if your GDP increases, GDP per head will increase, and therefore the living standards would increase. Okay. If you have a cut in income tax rates, it doesn't necessarily have an effect on your so again, if there's a cut in income tax rates, what does it mean? It means that what you earn, a lot of it you keep it to yourself. It incentivizes people to join the workforce and become entrepreneurs, become startup holders, or just get into a 9-to-5 job, right? What would that lead to? It would lead to an increase in your employment levels, right? It would lead to an increase in employment levels. If there's a cut in income taxes, you're going to have more money. What are you going to do with that more money? You can spend it or you can save it, right? You can invest it. You can save it. You can just buy more necessity goods for yourself, which will increase your own personal, living standards, not only right now, but even in the far-fetched future. So all of these are your 4 points. Okay, now for the against. If I cut income tax, what is the first and most important thing that's going to happen? My tax revenue is going to decrease, right? If my tax revenue decreases, government can't spend as much. There might be a budget deficit. There might be a budget deficit, and all of those things can happen, right? People might just buy more demerit goods. That public goods would decrease, or maybe a cut in income tax rates would not really affect people who are very, very so there's just many things or many ways that this can affect people. So if a cut in income tax rates, meaning that your tax revenues would decrease if there's a less amount of budget for your entire economy. You cannot provide you cannot give people transfer payments, you can't give them subsidies, you can't give them public goods and services. There are so many other things, and all of these are extremely important when it comes to living standards. If you cannot have if you don't have your public goods and services and your welfare payments and your unemployment payments and all of those stuff, you are not going to have an increase in your living standards. There's going to be a decrease in living standards. There might even be inflation going on, so your price of goods and services would increase, and that would decrease the living standards. There are many ways, it can go against or for. I've just decided to list the ones over here that I'm showing in the screen, right? Okay. How did I write the answer? A cut in income tax rates means that individuals would now pay less taxes at their respective tax brackets. This is just the plain definition of what a cut in the income tax rates mean. All right? Okay. This means that the individuals will have more disposable income in their hand than at the previous income levels. It means that even though let's say you earned $100 back then and you earn $100 right now, back then if you had to pay higher taxes, you might have only like $80 at your hand for your consumption and everything. Now you might have $90 for your own consumption and everything, right? So you have more disposable income in your hand. Okay. They can use this income to pay for their basic necessities and merit goods like education and healthcare, right? This would reduce poverty, which is a factor of living standards. Makes sense, right? If you have more money, you can go to school, you can go get your healthcare. This would reduce poverty. If you're getting into school, you're more likely to get into jobs, and that would reduce the poverty cycle that is in place in our economy. If there's less poverty or reduction in poverty, poverty is a factor of living standards. If you reduce poverty, there's going to be an increase in living standards. Okay, that's one point. That's one point done. Secondly, they can also choose to increase their individual demands that later contribute to the total demand. What does that mean? It means that if you have more money, you can demand more. You can get more luxury items that you otherwise might not have wanted. If there's an increase in consumption is positively related to the total demand or the aggregate demand, and therefore aggregate demand would increase, which would increase the GDP, which would then increase GDP per head and increase your living standards. Okay. Some might save their extra money or invest it back into the economy. Others can opt for imports or higher quantity purchases. All of these increase the living standards of your country. Okay. So, in short, I explained 2 points in details, and I stated a few other points just in case my points or my information points or any of my explanation does not hit the mark, does not, get me a guaranteed all the marks that I need. I just decide to put in more information in my first paragraph, right? I talk about investing, I talk about saving. I'm not really explaining these in details. I'm just stating that these happen. For example, you're taking quantity purchases and why it increases and therefore it increases the living standards, right? Okay. Now it's time for evaluation. However, it is hard to predict that what individuals would do with their income. If they spend it on demerit goods, like addictive goods, the living standards of the country would go down. What does that mean? It means that if you have more money, you can easily demand demerit goods, right? For example, you can demand drugs or alcohol. That would reduce your productivity. That would reduce your GDP. That would reduce a lot of the employment levels because people might not want to work anymore. So it might reduce employment levels. So your overall living standards might decrease, right? Okay, that's my 1 point with explanation. On another note, a reduction in tax rates would reduce the tax revenue, which means that there would be a decrease or a deficit in the government budget. So we're talking about the budget here. All right, how there's going to be a reduction in the budget. This has an impact on the government spending on more important sectors like public goods. Many are dependent on such government-provided or subsidized goods, and therefore a lack of government spending may decrease the living standards. Very simple. If you have a reduction in government budget, government spending would reduce. There's going to be an opportunity cost, right? The government cannot provide with services and goods and transfer payments. And if people don't get that money, a lot of the people who are dependent on the government for such goods and services, they would suffer, right? And therefore, the living standards might not increase. With that, we have all the 6 marks that we needed, all the points that we needed. And with that, we also finished the entire section A. If there's any other questions that you guys might have, or any part that you might not have understood, feel free to comment or reach out for us at ACE. We'd be more than happy to help out. Good luck for your exams.